Excellent. Well, thank you to the conference organizers for including our paper on the program. This is joint work with Andra Gent and Vasudha Nair. And we're going to be talking about or trying to understand determinants and consequences of return to office policies. So it goes without saying that particularly among this audience, it's important to understand return to office policies. And so what we're going to do in this paper is start by documenting what the post-COVID return to office or RTO policies for publicly traded firms are, what determines the policies that are chosen by those firms, and then we'll try to say something about some of the consequences of those policies as well. We think it's an important question because from the firm's perspective, trying to identify the optimal mix of in-person and remote work can have some pretty important value implications. We know from experimental evidence, for example, and some of the other empirical evidence that employees like being able to work from home. And in some cases, they're willing to accept lower wages in exchange for more work from home. Work from home also allows the firm to economize along some other dimensions, for example, saving money on office space or renting office space. At the same time, some in-person work is likely to be more productive than fully remote work. And obviously, the empirical evidence on the productivity of fully remote versus hybrid versus mixed is relatively mixed itself, but we're going to take the viewpoint that at least some in-person work for the average firm is likely to be more productive than just going fully remote. So from that sort of perspective, we're going to think about the firm's potential trade-off that they face between productivity gains from having people in the office at least some of the time, and then potential savings on wage bill and office space. And we're thinking from the perspective of the employers about trying to find that mix or identify the mix that optimizes profitability. So what we're going to do in large part is hand collect a data set on return to office policies and then classify the policies along two different dimensions that we think are important to study. We'll document using that data set a number of facts about return to office policies for publicly traded firms. We'll develop a really simple model or a conceptual framework that speaks to some of the key economic determinants, both at the city and industry level, that we think are going to be important for the specific RTO policy choice. We'll take those predictions to the data, and then we'll conclude by trying to understand some of the consequences of the firm's RTO choice. In particular, we'll look at stock market reaction to RTO announcements, and we'll look at how leasing activity, office space leasing activity responds as well. To briefly preview the results, we're going to start kind of the empirical analysis by documenting variation in RTO policies across a number of different dimensions. At sort of a high level, we're going to show that in our sample, roughly 80% of firms that publicly announce what their RTO policy is choose a policy that entails a mix of in-person work and work from home. Not surprisingly, though, there is going to be a lot of variation across industries, cities, and then we'll provide some evidence that firm and CEO characteristics matter a lot for these RTO policy choices as well. In the multivariate analysis, we're going to look at a number of economic factors and some firm-specific factors as well. And we'll show that, in particular, if we are thinking about the cities where firms are headquartered in, firms in cities where office space is more expensive pre-COVID tend to allow more remote work post-COVID. Firms in smaller cities also tend to allow more remote work. And then smaller firms headed by female CEOs and or younger CEOs also tend to allow more remote work. Finally, we don't document any significant stock market reaction to policies that firms announce that deviate from what their industry peers had announced prior. And so one way you could interpret that is that firms are on average getting it right when it comes to announcing policies relative to what their industry peers have announced. All right, we're going to fit into several strands of literature. There's a lot of folks in this room that have done work and or are working in these areas. So this list is by no means exhaustive. What the sort of tension relevant for our paper here is that workers may want more work from home than the most productive level from the firm's perspective. Okay, so a big part of the paper is collecting data on return to office policies and then developing a classification system that kind of hits two different dimensions. So I'll spend quite a bit of time talking about the data set that we collect, talk about how we classify firms, and then we'll get into the empirics. So there's two dimensions that we want to think about return to office policies along. Obviously, we want to understand what's the mix of in-person and remote work, but we also try to understand the level of discretion or lack thereof that lower or middle-level managers have, team leaders, department heads, or even individual employees with respect to what that mix is. Okay, so we're going to try to capture whether the return to office policy is a firm-wide policy that's set at the top and that applies regardless, or if the CEO is saying to department heads, team leaders, or even individual employees, you choose the mix of in-person versus remote work. So we're going to try to get at the discretion as well. So a couple key assumptions that are kind of floating around in the background here. When we talk about firms announcing their return to office policy, we're going to assume that if we observe a firm actually announce a policy, then at least some occupations within the firm can feasibly be done remotely. Consistent with that, the announced policies we're going to assume only apply to employees who could feasibly work remotely. So if you're in a firm where 0% of the work can be done off-site, we don't expect to see you announce in our sample period. Okay, so our starting point for data collection is the Russell 3000. So we're going to focus on the big publicly traded firms, and we're going to collect any return to office announcement that they make between March 1st, 2020 and June 1st, 2023. We're going to primarily use Factiva to source these policy announcements. In the event that we can't find an announcement from Factiva, we'll supplement our data using the Flex Index by Scoop data set. Key downside to the Flex Index data for the purposes of our study is we can't identify the exact announcement date. So a lot of the analysis that we'll do, because we want to identify when the announcement happened, is going to be on that Factiva subsample. Okay, so we're going to just do a basic keyword phrase search in Factiva. So for every single Russell 3000 firm, we're going to search a number of different phrases or words that we think should be suggestive of what their RTO policy is. We're only going to look at articles published in that announcement time period. And then we're going to read every single article manually, do some data filtering, and we're going to end up with a set of 839 firms that we can identify an announcement and the date on which the announcement occurred. We're going to supplement that where possible using this Flex Index data. We'll capture an additional 434 firms from Flex. And so in total, we've got 1,273 announcers. The remaining firms we're going to call non-announcers, okay? One important thing about the non-announcing firms is we're only able to capture public announcements. So it could be the case that these non-announcers send internal emails. Some of those could get picked up in the Flex Index because our understanding is the Flex Index does some crowdsourcing. It takes employee submissions. But at the end of the day, if the firm is not publicly announcing, it's not going to show up at least in kind of our main Factiva sample. Okay, so let's talk about the classification. Again, what we want to do is capture the mix of in-person and remote, and then the level of discretion or lack thereof. And what we have sort of settled on is a 5-part classification. So the two extremes, in-person and remote, those are pretty self-explanatory. An in-person firm says most employees have to be in the office 5 days a week. If you're remote, you can be remote 5 days a week. So those are our extremes. Then we've got our three kind of interior solutions. Hybrid and flexible, those are going to entail for all employees, there's a mix of in-office and remote work. Difference, though, is that a hybrid policy is one that applies firm-wide. A flexible policy means that that actual mix of in-person versus remote work is at the discretion of supervisors, of teams, lower-level managers, or the employees themselves. So that's where we're getting at this discretion dimension. And then we've got this fifth category called mixed. There are a number of firms in our sample that will actually announce 2 or even 3 distinct return to office policies that apply to different percentages of the employees. So we're trying to capture that with mixed. So we've got our 5-part classification system. One important aspect of the empirical analysis is we want to think about these policies on kind of a continuum from the most stringent, meaning you have to be in the office, to the least stringent, you never have to be in the office. And the way that we're thinking about it currently and kind of in what I'll present today is in the following sense. So we're going to call in-person the most stringent, remote is the least stringent. We're going to argue that hybrid is relatively more stringent than a flexible policy because with a flexible policy, you've got discretion. Mixed, we don't put anywhere on the continuum because it's not exactly clear where it's going to fall. We take care of that in the empirical analysis by comparing in-person to everything in the middle to remote. So kind of in this multivariate order probit framework that we're going to have, we just have 3 categories. We're lumping all those interior solutions together. We use a bunch of other data that, in the interest of time, I won't talk too much about. What I will say is that all of the kind of control variables or cross-sectional cuts that we're going to use are going to be measured as of either the end of 2018 or the end of 2019. So we're going to capture firm, industry, and city characteristics pre-COVID and look at how those affect what you announce during COVID. All right, let's get into the results. So non-announcers versus announcers. Okay, we're again just going to be focusing the analysis on the announcing firms. It's important to keep in mind that the announcing firms tend to be larger than the non-announcers. So the sort of caveat is that the inferences or conclusions we're going to make when we look at the announcing firms apply to the top part of the Russell 3000. So these are going to be the biggest publicly traded firms. Announcement timing. So this is going to be important to the analysis. Again, in our Factiva sample, we can identify the date on which this announcement takes place. We think about announcement timing in this paper for a couple different reasons. First is that early announcers or announcements that happen really early in the sample period, say Q2, Q3, Q4, 2020, may be driven in large part by uncertainty that's public health related as opposed to economic fundamentals. So if we see you announce early in the sample period, maybe that has less to do with industry and city characteristics and more to do with the fact that we don't know what is going on, right? It's COVID, it's new. Whereas if you announce later in the sample period, after some of that uncertainty has been resolved, we tend to think maybe that's more driven by the fundamentals. You could also think about this as early announcers because they are larger, which is in this table here. Maybe those are market or industry leaders. And so announcement timing may provide sort of a story where it's the early announcers that are kind of setting the tone in their industry, and then the late announcers, these smaller firms, are just doing whatever the big firms are doing. So 2 important reasons to think about the timing. Okay, so here's a look at the data. So I'll just go through several different figures, and then we'll get into the regressions. So here's the distribution of the announcers or the announcement policies in our sample. Like I said, most of the policies are going to lie somewhere in the interior. So we've got about 10% remote, 10% in person. The rest are going to be in that mixed, hybrid, or flexible category. Not surprisingly, there's a lot of variation across industries, particularly because certain industries have a higher share of telecommutable occupations. And again, this is all measured pre-COVID. So if you think about the pre-COVID telecommutable share in an industry like information, finance and real estate, and management up there on the top right, you tend to think more of those jobs can be done remotely. Consistent with that, we see more remote announcers in that industry compared to, say, construction. In construction, we see more in-person announcements. Another way to visualize that is using the actual work from home share from Dingle-Neiman 2020, consistent kind of with what I talked about before. Remote firms tend to have higher telecommutable shares, or they tend to be in industries with higher telecommutable shares than in-person firms. So a couple different ways to think about industry. Stuff varies by city as well. So San Francisco, San Jose, because of industry mix, tend to have more remote announcers than, for example, Houston, which has a lot of in-person announcers. And by the way, the city is specific to where the headquarters is located. Firm characteristics matter, not surprisingly, as well. So larger firms and older firms tend to announce more in-person policies relative to smaller and younger firms. On the CEO side, older CEOs and male CEOs tend to announce more in-person policies than younger CEOs and female CEOs. So we think, given kind of the univariate analysis, that industry, city, and firm characteristics are going to matter a lot to what you're actually choosing. To provide a more kind of formal framework for the city and industry characteristics specifically, we write down a really simple model, a trade-off model, in which firms are going to choose, I should go back, the level of in-person work depending on how productive in-person is versus remote, depending on how expensive office and residential real estate space in their city is. It's going to depend on commute times, and it's going to depend on city size as well. So kind of just getting into the predictions, 5 predictions about your industry or city come out of this model. At the industry level, we predict that higher productivity loss from off-site work is going to be associated with a more stringent policy where you have to be in person more. And then the other 4 predictions are specific to your city. With respect to real estate prices, more expensive office space we think or predict is going to be associated with more remote work. On the other hand, if you're located in a city with more expensive residential real estate price, we think that's going to be correlated with more in-person work. Intuition there is that if you're allowing or asking firms to work employees to work remotely most of the time, at some point they're going to need to upsize their house because they need some home office space, to the extent that you have to compensate them through higher wage if residential real estate is more expensive. And again, this is pre-COVID. We think that we're going to see more in-person work. And then finally, we think longer commute times are going to be associated with more remote work, and larger cities, due to some agglomeration externalities, should see more in-person work. So let's take this to the data. We've got a really, really basic cross-sectional regression we're going to run. On the left-hand side, we've got a variable equal to 3 if you're in person, 2 if you're anywhere in the middle, and then 1 if you're remote. Okay? And then on the right-hand side, we've got some proxies for the characteristics that come out of the model and some firm characteristics as well. So we're going to proxy for the ex-ante, or I should say pre-COVID, productivity of remote work using the telecommutable share within an industry. Then we've got a measure of office rent, home prices, commute time, city size, and then we'll throw the firm characteristics that we think should matter in there as well. Okay, there's a ton of stuff going on. Let me just walk you through what's important here. So first thing, a negative sign means that the relevant variable is associated with more remote work. We break to really get at the impact of the most expensive cities, largest cities, et cetera, all of our independent variables into terciles. So we're looking at 3 different terciles for each of the independent variables. Key takeaways are that firms that are in cities with more expensive office space tend to announce more remote. We've got weaker statistically, albeit consistent in sign evidence that more expensive home prices tend to be associated with more in-person work. City size seems to matter, so larger cities, we see more in-person announcers. And then larger firms, firms with older CEOs, and firms with male CEOs tend to announce more in-person policies.
So T3 means top tercile?
Yes, yep, so yeah, so the excluded tercile is the bottom tercile. Okay, let's see. Early versus late announcers, won't say a ton about this in the interest of time, other than announcement timing doesn't seem to matter a whole lot. We do a lot of work in the paper to try to rule out that early versus late announcers perform or announce significantly differently. So announcement timing doesn't matter a whole lot. Got a bunch of robustness checks in the paper that I won't talk in detail about. The only thing that I will say is that one thing that we do acknowledge is that there are many multi-establishment firms in our sample. So you've got firms that are headquartered in one city, but that have offices in other cities. Similarly, firms whose headquarters fit in one industry, but who have establishments in other industries. And so we try to get at that by running versions of our regressions where we weight each of our controls based on the employment share in a particular city, and the results are qualitatively unchanged. Okay, so that was determinants. Let's talk a little bit about the consequences of return to office policies. The cost of office space seems to matter a lot. And we also, when we actually read the text of these announcements, oftentimes see firms literally talk about downsizing office space when they're discussing their return to office policies. So one really basic kind of first pass that we take at this, and this is still relatively new, is we look at for firms that eventually announce in person versus something else, whether those firms sign whether those firms sign more office leases in their headquarters city post-COVID. So now we've got, instead of a cross-sectional regression, we've got a firm year panel. Don't have a ton of significance, but it's sort of in this really limited sample that we've been able to gather leases for so far, some promising evidence that the firm's choice of being in person is showing up in their office lease activity.
Is this just a count of leases, or did you manage to get square footage or something?
Yeah, so we've looked also at square footage, we've looked at rent per square foot, concessions, we've looked at a whole host of other things. This is really where it's showing up, is just in the raw count. Mm-hmm. Great question. Okay, so finally, we're gonna look at stock returns surrounding the announcement itself. What we're gonna do to get a proxy for something like an earnings surprise, like you might see in the accounting literature, is we're going to look at whether firm I announces a policy that's significantly more or less stringent than its industry peers have previously announced. We're gonna call that the deviation. So do you announce remote when everyone else in your industry is going in person, right? That's gonna be what we're trying to proxy for here. And so we're going to, using kind of the standard return regression, see whether deviations from your industry peers are priced into stock returns. And we don't see anything so far. So regardless of sort of the measure of returns that we're using, we don't see the stock market react significantly when you deviate from your industry peers. Okay, perfect. So about 5 minutes left. I'll wrap up and then take some questions. So we collect data on publicly traded firms, RTO policies. We document a wide range of variation in RTO policies across cities, industries, and then firm characteristics themselves, consistent with a simple trade-off model. Office rents and city size really seem to matter for the mix of in-person versus remote work. Firm characteristics and CEO characteristics also appear to be correlated as well. And in terms of the consequences, we don't see anything significant in stock prices, although it does seem that firms respond vis-a-vis their leasing activity. So thank you so much, and looks like I got a few minutes for questions. Yeah.
I'd love to see descriptive stats on number of return to the office announcements per firm. I don't know if you collected all that data. You didn't use it in your analysis, which is fine. Although I do think, my impression is many firms announced and re-announced because the first announcement didn't take. So for example, in your stock market analysis, you might want to sort between, keep the focus on first announcement, but sort between firms that actually, where it actually seemed to work and those that didn't. Second comment I wanted to make, there are confounders at work, I think. And I just want to point them out, and not that it's a criticism of what you've done, but you think about higher wage employees, they're likely to prefer more remote work. That's what surveys say. But also the tax code itself. If you think about what the tax code implies, obviously remote work, to the extent workers enjoy working from home, is an untaxed benefit. The value of shifting from taxed forms of compensation to untaxed forms of compensation rises with the marginal tax rates. Who pays the higher marginal tax rates? It tends to be in the same industries that on your Dingle-Neiman measure, for example, will show up as high remote work intensity. So some of what you're picking up as just how suitable is the industry for remote work may also be a consequence of the way the tax system interacts with the choice between taxed and untaxed forms of compensation.
Yeah, so going in reverse, I think your second point, that's totally fair. I don't know that we're talking a lot about that in the paper, but it's certainly a confounder that's there. The extent to which we're sort of able to address it, I'm not sure, but we can definitely
just take a note of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And then in terms of repeat announcements, that's something that we're actually going to do in sort of the next draft, because we do observe firms make multiple announcements throughout the sample period. And among other things, we want to try to understand the extent to which they're updating those announcements, or if they're saying, look, we say people are going to be in person, and we kind of stick with that. Yeah, we'll get here. Yeah.
Two thoughts really quick. So on that point, I was wondering whether you could do some matching analysis and do a staggered diff and diff. Because you probably can do a pure diff and diff because every firm had some announcement. Yeah. But you could do a staggered diff and diff here. And the other thought I had on the antecedents was whether you could look at whether legacy incentives that the firms had received from municipalities or cities, tax breaks, if you come here, is driving some of this behavior. Because, with Amazon, one question I've thought about, and I don't know the answer, is whether the second headquarter tax breaks they received is driving some of the behavior.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I don't know that we've thought about that, but it's definitely something we can think more deeply about, yeah. I think Dennis, yeah.
So I had a very quick suggestion to help maybe with the stock market analyses. So sometimes analysts ask CEOs about remote work policies on a conference call. So the CEO has to deal with it right away, and you could see sometimes that's happening during regular hours, other times it's during aftermarket or pre-market. So you could see the response almost in real time and search for the disclosure of, sort of text disclosure of the earnings calls for remote work and see how the markets react, volume and returns.
Yeah, so that's a great point. We do include, as a type of announcement, looking at transcripts of earnings calls, but I think we could use that to tighten up the timing a little bit better. Thanks. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone in the room, and good afternoon or good evening or good morning if you are online. And it's a great pleasure to be here. So I'm Mark Ma from University of Pittsburgh, and what a great paper just presented. And to be honest, I'm not aware of this paper. But it's fascinating to me that a lot of our findings are actually quite consistent, right? So there must be some truth in it. So this paper is a joint work with our very smart and hardworking PhD student, Yu Ye. And both of us are from the accounting group and the School of Business and the University of Pittsburgh. So actually, for many, many years, accounting scholars has been doing research on the intersection of accounting and labor economics on topics such as executive compensation, pay transparency, and pay disparity. And from a few years ago, a group of accounting professors actually organized a conference about labor economics and accounting, and the first conference was hosted by Stanford University, but it was a virtual conference, and I presented a paper about CEO pay ratio and the conference. And if you further look down the program, there is a familiar name, which is Nick, and Nick gives a keynote speak about work from home. That's how I got my first exposure to work from home research. And since then, I started following news about work from home. My hobby now is to follow news about return to office mandates. And remote work existed for decades, and the COVID-19 pandemic pushed workplace flexibility to an unprecedented level, according to papers by Jose, Nick, and Steve. And to the peak, 61.5% of full work days in the US are work from home days in May 2022. And in my opinion, this is one of the greatest social experiment we have in history, because if you think about the medical experiment of COVID vaccine, about 70% of people are fully vaccinated in the country. And this experiment at least affects like 60% of US working adults. And after the threat of COVID-19 rescinded, many companies reconsidered their workplace policy, where a lot of firms, such as NVIDIA and Airbnb, are sticking to working from home mode. A lot of others, such as Amazon and Dell, actually have implemented or are considering return to office mandates. So I learned from Nick. Nick talks about Google Trends. So I also prepare Google Trends for return to office. So if you look at the Google Trends for return to office, it started to pick up from the second quarter of 2021. So that's also based on our data that many firms announced return to office mandates from that quarter. And it reached a peak in the last week of January 2024. So it's still a very hot topic in 2024. And recently, after Amazon's 5-day RTO, it reached another peak. So there's a lot of interest in this topic. And further, if you look at the Google trend for hybrid jobs, actually it reached recently reached a peak after Amazon's 5-day RTO. So I'm pretty sure a lot of Amazon employees are searching for hybrid jobs nowadays. And actually, I've closely followed many Amazon employees' LinkedIn posts. And again, my hobby is to follow news about return to office mandates. So today in my presentation, I will not only talk about my research, I will also talk about a lot of interesting stories about return to office that you may think is more interesting than my paper. So a big reason why these return to office mandates are so controversial are the flip-flops by the CEOs and firms. For example, if you look at this article, it says that after being told they could work from home forever, employees made major life changes. They moved further away from their office. They moved to the good school district. And then a new CEO came and ordered them back to office. And this change clearly upset a lot of employees. And this change is due to a new CEO, but a lot of CEOs just changed their opinions. Like the CEO for Meta and the CEO of Snap. Both of them previously praised working from home, but then asked their employees back to office. And however, the good news is not all CEOs agree with them, or at least some CEOs did not agree with them at a certain point back in a few years ago, such as Michael Dell actually said that if your firm is forcing employees back to office, you are doing it wrong. All right. However, 1 year later, you know what happened? Dell asked employees to go back to the office. And half of the employees decided that we will continue to work from home. And Dell tell employees that if you continue to work from home, you will not be promoted. So these employees gave up their career opportunities and decided to stay to continue work from home. So clearly, working from home or the flexibility is important for them. By watching Nick's interviews and learn a term, revealed preference, and I think this reveals this employee's preference. And when I prepare for this talk, so I did a little more search about Dell, and I found this very interesting article. Michael Dell recently said something else. So he said that if you have a lot of data and you are not using AI, you are doing it wrong. So don't be surprised if 1 year later he came back and tell us AI is a bubble. And if I'm allowed to make some change to this statement, I would change it to if your company is using AI for data analytics, but not making RTO decisions based on data, you are doing it wrong. So even Zoom had a return to office mandate. We would think if everyone works from home, Zoom will make a lot of money, right? However, the reality is a lot of employees told me when they are asked to go back to office, they still make Zoom calls on their laptop, and they never have interactions with their colleagues in the office. So the real irony of this story is a Fortune magazine journalist asked a Zoom executive about its company's return to office mandate. And the executive said that the return to office mandate is a great success. And then the journalist asked the executive, how many days do you go back to office? And the executive's answer is, I'm still working from home. And recently, Amazon's RTO story attracted a lot of attention. Like, this is a timeline for Amazon's RTO story. So back in 2022, when the current CEO, Andy Jassy, just took over the CEO leadership, he said that the company has no plan to bring employees back to office. And 6 months later, Amazon imposes a 3-day RTO. And 1 year later, Amazon imposed a 5-day RTO. Clearly, this is one of the biggest news in the corporate world over the last months. And I need to thank Annie Palmer for continuously covering this interesting story. And if any of the journalists from CNBC looking at the video, please say thank you to Annie. And also, what's really interesting is before the mandate, Amazon actually allowed team choice, allowed the managers to decide what's the best approach for their own team. And currently, a lot of experts think that's the best approach. So they moved away from the best approach to mandates. And all these CEOs openly changed their positions, and someone actually tried to secretly change his position. So back in 2022, Elon Musk declared end to remote working on Tesla. And recently, Tesla posted some job for remote workers. So you can work from home anywhere in the world and make $270,000. So I have to say, Elon is a very special CEO. So clearly, RTO has been heavily debated, and one of the CEO's arguments for RTO is working from home reduce employee productivity and hurt firm performance and values. So a lot of such examples, like if you look at this WISE article, it says that commercial real estate titan says remote employees do not work as hard. And I guess they are not very happy when they see those empty office buildings in downtown, and they do not really like the donuts. And then Elon Musk said that remote workers are just pretending to work. And the Nike CEO came out and said that the company's lack of success and innovation is due to remote work. And the most dramatic story is the ex-Yahoo CEO still blames remote work as the reason for the bad performance of the company during her term, 10 years after she was fired. So she still believes that's the reason. And then from the employees' standpoint, many employees actually disagree with the managers. They argue that the elimination of long commutes and the enhanced flexibility actually contribute to higher productivity and better overall well-being. So here is a LinkedIn post by one of the software development manager at Amazon. I told you that I follow all the news and all the LinkedIn posts. And it's a very long post. He is very upset about Amazon's 5-day RTO. To summarize it, so I would say the most important information here is he said, we have learned that we can be wildly productive with remote work. And he said that his team has no problem with the team's performance while working from home. And another senior manager from Google also made a post about Amazon's CEO, Amazon's 5-day return to office. And she said that remote work did not hurt performance. If anything, it provides employees with flexibility. And in addition to these very successful managers and these two largest firms in the world, the highest ranked employee of the Singapore government, the Singapore Prime Minister, also said that we should encourage firms to provide work from home opportunities even after the pandemic. So from the employee's perspective and from the middle-level manager's perspective, clearly working from home has a lot of benefits. So our study used a sample of SP 500 firms to try to understand the determinants and the consequences of RTO mandates. And we collect RTO information through manual search on Google and Effectiva by using the company's name and the keywords like work from home, return to office, and the days required working in the office. And we are able to identify 137 publicly announced RTOs, and we exclude 43 SP 500 firms from our sample, which do not have such an announcement, but have more than 70% of employees reporting no work from home options on Indeed. And here is the distribution of those RTO announcements. And as I said that, as I showed you in the Google Trends earlier, so there are a lot of RTOs starting from the second quarter of 2021. So the first question we study is, why do firms RTO? So again, the manager's argument is RTO will lead to higher productivity. If so, the firm should have better performance and higher valuation. And based on this argument, I would expect firms whose CEO has more equity ownership to impose more RTO. That's because not all CEOs care about firm value and firm performance to the same extent. And those with more equity ownership will care more about the firm's value and performance. However, on the other hand, employees suggest that managers feel that they have lost control over the employees, and they do not trust the employees. They want to regain the power back, grab the power back in the employee-employee relationship when they do not see the employees working physically in the office. Therefore, RTO could be used to reassert control over the employees. And if this is true, I would expect those CEOs who are more likely to seek power inside firms to have more RTOs, because these are the CEOs who are more concerned about losing control over the employees. And another explanation by the employees is that managers are just trying to use RTO to blame employees as a scapegoat for poor performance. And if this is true, I would expect CEOs in firms with poor performance to impose more RTOs. All right, so that's the three predictions we have. And more recently, layoff become another reason. But our sample ends relatively early. So for most time of our sample period, probably most firms didn't consider layoff as the real reason for its RTO. But we will, when we extend the sample, we will examine layoff as a potential reason for RTO. So as some anecdotal evidence, again, this is my hobby to look at the stock performance of these RTO firms. Actually, many RTO firms issued their mandates after stock price crash, like including UPS, Amazon, Boeing, Nike, and Snap. And my favorite story is about Snap. And if you look at Snap's RTO, so Snap issued the first RTO back in 2022 after its stock price decreased by 80% from its previous peak. All right, so at that time, they still gave some exceptions. If you have medical reasons or family reasons, you can still work from home. And then earlier this year, Snap's stock price crashed by another 30%. And after this, there's no exceptions anymore. Everyone should come back to office. And similar story for Nike. So if you look at Nike's RTO timing, so the first RTO is after a 30% decrease from its prior peak. And then the second RTO, again, is after a stock price crash. So to test whether the managers are correct or whether the employees are correct, we try to see the potential predictors for RTO decisions. So here, the dependent variable is an indicator for firm quotas after RTO announcements. And we found, first, firms with negative prior stock returns are more likely to RTO. So that's consistent with managers are trying to blame employees by using RTO for the bad stock performance. And then we found firms with more powerful CEOs and male CEOs are more likely to impose RTO. So that's actually consistent with the last paper.
How do you measure SIEPR?
So power is measured based on the relative compensation of the CEO to other executives' compensation. So if a company, inside a company, because other C-suite executives are actually partially assigned by the CEO. And if the CEO wants a lot of power, he will assign some really junior, unexperienced people, and those people's compensation will become relatively low. But if I really want to hear advice or suggestions from other executives, I will pay them really well, right? So that's our measure of CEO power. And we do not, and it's important that we do not find a significant association between CEO ownership and the probability of RTO. And also, we do not find a significant association between recent performance change or recent change in ROA and RTO. That means these RTO are not really due to change or decrease in recent financial performance. The recent financial performance is still doing well. It's just the stock price crashed, maybe due to change in the firm's future perspective rather than employees are not been working hard recently. So the second question we ask is, how did employees react to these RTO mandates? So again, some anecdotal evidence. I like collecting these stories. And so after Amazon's first RTO, nearly 2,000 Amazon workers walked out to protest such RTO mandates. And recently, after the 5-day RTO, Raj just told me that 60% or 70% of Amazon employees on LinkedIn became open to work. And in a more local, to me, a story, a company, IBX, headquartered in Philadelphia, in the state of Pennsylvania. And after its RTO, a lot of employees get very upset and they feel betrayed, and a lot of them started finding jobs. And also one of the middle-level manager, an IBX director, came out and actually said that it's morally wrong to tell people that this is your workplace mode, and then change it without insufficient notice, and not accounting for the fact that this is going to be really hard for a lot of people. And this middle-level manager does not like it, and he does not want to enforce it. And I think that's the reality. And a lot of firms, these firms have RTO, but the middle-level managers are not enforcing them. So to see whether the negative reaction by employees are widespread. We look at employees' job satisfaction ratings on Glassdoor. So we collect all the employee job satisfaction ratings before and after these RTO mandates, and we found that after RTO mandates, sorry, I'm not sure whether I have laser. Okay, that's great. So after RTO mandates, job satisfaction significantly dropped for these firms with RTO. So that means, in general, employees react negatively to these RTO mandates. And the third question we ask is whether these RTOs are good or bad to firm performance, because firm performance is the reason, or productivity is the reason given by the managers, right? So if we further take a look at Snap and Nike, after their most recent RTO, their stock price decreased by another 20%. So it doesn't seem to be working well for them. Of course, you could also find examples where the stock price increased after RTOs. So whether in a large sample, whether it's positive or negative, so we did some tests. And we look at whether the firm's return on assets, earnings before income tax and amortization, and also Tobin's Q, a measure of firm valuation changes. And we do not find significant changes. And these are important because according to Nick, what firms care about ultimately is profitability, right? So if they care about profitability, then they probably shouldn't do aggressive RTOs. So here is the summary of our study. So our study do not really support the argument that managers impose mandates because they believe RTO increase firm value. And our results are consistent with managers using RTOs to reassert control over employees and blame employees for bad firm performance. And further, we found significant declines in employee job satisfaction after RTO mandates, but there is no change in financial performance or firm value after RTO mandates. And our study has several limitations. First, we do not have exogenous shocks, so we cannot rule out all the endogeneity concerns or alternative explanations. And also, we cannot test the long-term effects yet because we do not have a long enough sample. And also, the labor market after the pandemic has been really tight, and that may be a special time period. And also, we have only a limited sample of large firms. Therefore, we have a few next steps. And we believe there are a lot of important research questions remain unanswered. For example, after the second presentation, I'm thinking whether, so in another project, we found that female workers are more likely to resign from a job after RTO mandates. And I'm wondering whether that's related to potential harassment in the workplace. And after the first paper, I'm thinking, given these offices are being so noisy, whether after RTO mandates, whether there will be more sales of noise-canceling headsets on Amazon or something like that. I think there are a lot of exciting, interesting research topics we could look at. And but again, I think a big problem for us is we do not have those external shocks, and I'm really jealous that the first three authors all run their experiments. So my next step is trying to find an organization and run some field experiments on RTO issues to see what's the best approach for them to convert RTO from a crisis to opportunities. And also, at the same time, I wish to see more studies on RTO and remote work from all the degree workers, all the degree scholars. And thank you. And finally, I hope every workplace is flexible, inclusive, sustainable, and happy. I call this a fish workplace. And that's all of my presentation.
Thank you so much for this presentation. That was a joy to watch, so I appreciate that. One question I have for you is how you're thinking about the duration of time it takes for a lot of this work. So I think if you say remote work, yeah, we can all send an email from work just as, productively as if I'm in the office. But a lot of the arguments are a lot of the work that it takes to be very innovative. So the work we're doing today, we may not realize the benefits of that innovation for 2, 3, 5, 10 years, right? And so a lot of the arguments are, we need you in the office for that type of work, for that type of collaboration, that idea generation, that brainstorming, to be able to work on those tricky, hard products. So when we say, oh, we're not seeing a change in stock market today, one argument could be, well, we haven't seen the realization of the work that's being done. So how are you thinking about that time horizon of the work that people are saying needs to be done in person, and we're going to see the fruits of that 5 years later, maybe?
Yes, that's a really good question. And I think Nick recently posted a paper about deep work. And the authors show that working from home is good for deep work and deep thoughts. And in my opinion, innovation is a cross-product of deep thoughts and also exchange of opinions. Right? So I think working from home could help employees to have deeper thoughts about very important issues. And then they could come to office and have team meetings and exchange their opinions. That may, in my opinion, that would be the best way to facilitate innovation. And to do that, you do not really need to have RTO mandates. Because companies like yesterday, Twilio's CEO actually came out and said that as long as I'm here, you guys are not doing RTO. However, that doesn't mean the employees are not meeting with each other. It's just the employees will have choice and the teams have choice. There is no minimum number of days in office. And you could have a choice about how many days you want to meet in the office and where you want to meet in the office. And I think that's the most flexible approach. And I think that's probably the most promising approach. And also about innovation, I really try to do some tests about innovation. Like a lot of measures are based on patents. However, it takes like 3 years to file those patents, right? So currently we cannot do that. But as one of my next steps, I'm trying to contact a firm to see whether I could run experiments. Maybe ask some employees to do a team choice approach, some employees to do a 3-day in-office approach, and to see which group or which team could come up with better new ideas or better product designs, things like that. Yes, I think that's a very important question, and there could be a lot of another very exciting research project about it. Yes.
And just I'll add one follow-on. I think a tricky part of we'll come in when we need to do our team meetings. Well, if we're all distributed, does that really work, right? If I moved to Maui and someone moved to Chicago and we say, okay, we're all going to do our deep work, now let's come into the office together to do the team-based work. Flying everybody to one office every week. So I don't know if that's an actual question, rhetorical question, but I think it shows the difficulty of saying, let's be flexible. Well, can you be flexible if everyone's across the globe, and then do you bring them together? I just think it gets really tricky.
Yeah, that could be two different types of firms, I think. One is fully distributed firms. These are like employees from anywhere in the world. And I know such firms. Like Indeed is one of such examples. And there are very few in-person interactions for their company. However, on the other hand, if you allow team choice, probably those team members will choose to live in a place where it's close and convenient for the team to meet, right? And if they can't really come to the meet, probably that's not the right employer and not the right employer for the person, and also not the right employee for the firm, right? And they could try to find another firm better match their interest.
Hi, thank you so much. I have kind of a continuation on that question, because I think another thing that might be missed in some of these like shorter term analysis is the impact on like development of younger workers. So like in a remote role, it's quite difficult for a younger worker like myself, I just graduated, to have the proper like mentorship and guidance that you get within an in-person setting. And so I wonder if you have any ideas on like how that might be captured, because that's not really going to be able to be measured within these firms, for another 3 or 4 years. And I think I don't see that as part of the reasoning for return to office, at least according to these CEOs, but it is something quite important, right? Like the development of the next generation of workers.
So should I respond? Yeah. So that's a really good question. And actually today, Amazon came out to defend their RTO policy by arguing that we are trying to provide better training to the employees by asking all the employees going back to the office. But is that necessary? And actually, my recommendation is, yes, you could ask more younger employees to go to office more often. And these younger employees actually want to go to office more often. But at the same time, you need to make sure that there are mentors for them who they can talk to, right? So, and also very importantly, you need to pay the mentors to be there in the office. Otherwise, the mentors also do not want to go there, actually. So I have a 3-point recommendation. That's one point. The first point is team choice and employee choice. The second point is provide mentors for younger workers and ask them to go to office more often. The third point is promote flexible team leaders, because at a lot of firms, if you are working remote or working from home, you will not be promoted. However, if you are not promoting an employee just because they are working from home, not because of their performance, then these employees will actually look for other opportunities. So that's not good. I think they should actually promote these flexible workers, and by doing that, they will actually increase the loyalty of these employees because they see a career path for them inside the firm. Yes.
Great. Okay.